this in school. Mike's heard of this hymn before. He might have. Yeah, we are. Yeah, whenever you're ready. If it's something we're turning on, you get to do a announcement. Your call to worship. So do you want to go to where you want to truly place?
We're going to go ahead and get started. It's 9:30. I trust that some others are on their way and will arrive soon. Thank you for coming to week 1 of Canon and the Future of Methodism. I think everyone here knows that our denomination has changed and is changing, and so the question we want to take up this morning and in the weeks to come is what kind of some of those changes are and where we may or may not fit into them. Before we get started with the session itself, we do want to gather together in a spirit of worship, and so I'll ask Matthew and Mike to lead us in a hymn.
All right, this morning we're going to play Stump the Organist, so Mike has no idea what we're about to sing. Good luck with that. We're going to start off easy this week and then get harder and harder as the weeks go by. We're going to start with "Oh, for a Thousand Tongues to Sing." So this is hymn number 57, and your hymnals that are in front of you. Yep, we're actually going to use those this morning. The words are not on the screen. I invite you to stand, sit, sing. Let's worship together.
57.
Oh, for a thousand tongues to sing
that bids our sorrow cease. 'Tis music in the sinner's ears, 'tis life and health and peace. He speaks, and listening to his voice, new life the dead receive. The mournful broken hearts rejoice, the humble poor believe. In him ye deaf, his praise ye dumb, your loosened tongues employ. Ye blind, behold your Savior come, and leap ye lame for joy. In Christ your head you then shall know, you feel your sins forgive, anticipate your heavenly low, and own that love is heaven.
All right, you may be seated. Thanks be to God.
Matt, thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Mike. I'm shocked that we weren't able to stump you. Yeah. Well, as I mentioned before, the United Methodist Church has changed and is changing. That is true in lots of different ways, but obviously, or maybe not so obviously to some of you, the reason we are engaging this topic is because of some of the quite specific ways in which it has changed in recent years and even in recent months. Many of you are already aware, perhaps because you followed our annual conference gathering earlier this summer, or because you just saw or read one of the reports on the conference here at Canon. You may already know that during this past summer's annual conference gathering, North Georgia Conference gathering, 70 churches, 70 local churches disaffiliated. We approved or ratified the disaffiliation of 70 churches in the North Georgia Annual Conference. There were churches in every one of our 8 districts who chose to disaffiliate from the North Georgia Annual Conference. And so that specific picture is sort of part of a bigger picture. And many people refer to the splitting, that the church is splitting. I'm not sure if that's supposed to be dramatic music or what that is. But I believe that it's more accurate to say that what our church is... They're rehearsing and he's still plugged into the sanctuary. Right. What is happening in the United Methodist Church is not so much a split as a splintering. I can almost time my comments to the music now. And of course, it's ironic that we're laughing when I'm talking about something that is actually fairly distressing. A split, if you think about it, sounds like a divorce, which is negotiated and formal. You don't just declare we're getting divorced. There are lots of conversations. There's an agreement to the separating of property, and if they're children, the care of children. The United Methodist Church, or the Methodist movement, has undergone splits in the past. In 1844, the northern and southern halves of the Methodist Episcopal Church split. There was a month-long general conference, the longest general conference in history, during which they negotiated a split into northern and southern churches. They split over the issue of slavery. What's happening right now is not really a split, it's a splintering, which is to say that United Methodist people, pastors, and churches are leaving the United Methodist Church, and they're going in lots of different directions. A couple, not that many, of the 70 churches who disaffiliated from the North Georgia Conference this past summer, a couple of them have joined the Global Methodist Church, and I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. Most, however, have chosen to, at least to this point, to become independent churches, unaffiliated with any larger body. I know of one very large church. Some of you may be familiar with Fraser Memorial in Alabama. They have disaffiliated from their annual conference and from the United Methodist Church, but they've chosen to join the Free Methodist Church. There's also a very large, formerly UMC church in Houston, which is united with the United Church in Christ, which is a more progressive denomination. People are leaving, and local churches are leaving from both the left and the right. And so what we're undergoing is actually a splintering. And that is distressing, and I hope that we all grieve that reality. Because, of course, the deeper reality is that we are all one in Christ, whether or not we want to be. But we struggle to live out the unity which is ours in Jesus. If you think for a moment, we're all members of a biological family or an adopted family. We have a core family. We are members of that family whether or not we want to be, and the siblings we have are our siblings. We may or may not be close to them. We may or may not like them, but they remain family. And everyone who is in Christ is our brother and our sister, whether or not we like them. And so the unity of the church is both a gift and a calling. It is a gift of God, unearned, undeserved, not something we make or create. But we also are called to live into that unity, and we struggle with that in lots of different ways. So what is happening is a splintering of the United Methodist Church. It was in some ways accelerated by the formation of the Global Methodist Church, which officially launched on May 1st. And you may already know that it existed as a legal entity starting on May 1st, but no churches belonged to the GMC at that time. Some now do, because we have passed the sort of official disaffiliation date, which was the end of June, when we approved those 70 churches departing from our conference and from the United Methodist Church in early June. The disaffiliation date was at the end of the month. That's how those agreements were set up. And so starting on July 1st, they officially became independent or members of the Global Methodist Church. And so all of this has unfolded according to a disaffiliation process, which we'll get to, adopted by the United Methodist Church at its General Conference in 2019. Recognizing that the church remained divided over issues of sexuality, specifically same-sex marriage and the ordination of LGBTQIA persons, they adopted a process for local churches to disaffiliate, to exit the denomination, over matters of conscience involving human sexuality, whether they were leaving because they thought the church was too exclusive or too inclusive. Whether they were traditional or progressive, this process was created to provide an easier, sort of a simpler path for local churches to exit from the denomination. And so this issue very often is kind of presented. Well, let me stop right there, actually. What I want to do is I'll pause periodically to see if there are any questions so far. And so what I wanted to get in front of you initially is just that what we are facing, what we're experiencing is a splintering, not a split, and some of where that came from. Let me just pause and stop and ask if there are any questions at this point. Sure. So the question was about a little bit more information, context about the 70 churches who chose to disaffiliate. So there are roughly 890 local churches in the North Georgia Conference of the United Methodist Church. Most of you are familiar with how the United Methodist Church is structured, right? So we belong to the North Georgia Conference, roughly everything north of Macon. The northern half of the state, that's the NGUMC. About 890 churches. These were 70 churches. Most of them, the vast majority of them, are small rural churches, 20 or fewer in worship on an average Sunday. There were just a couple that were larger membership churches. That is not to say that they are the last. I'm sure that there will be another wave of disaffiliations next summer during that annual conference gathering. And we'll see if that pattern persists or if it changes, if you have more larger membership churches who choose to disaffiliate. Does that answer the question? All right. So the Global Methodist Church was organized by the Wesleyan Covenant Association. It's the product of really years of kind of planning on the part of some traditionalist Christians, pastors, churches who wanted to be in a denomination where there was unity of thought and practice around issues of human sexuality. And so they have formed a new denomination They have adopted some of what is currently in the United Methodist Book of Discipline. That's the book that kind of organizes our church, our denomination, and our local churches. And so a lot of what's in our discipline is actually in the Global Methodist Church's Book of Doctrine and Disciplines. They are also, by name, you can tell, the intent is to be a global church, to be national and also global, to be specifically traditional when it comes to issues of human sexuality. I want to stress that when I use, and I'll get back to this, language of traditional and progressive in this conversation, that's only with respect to issues of sexuality. So one of the ways that we can get kind of fuzzy in our thinking is to assume that if we're progressive on one issue, we must be progressive on all issues. Or if we're traditional on one issue, we're traditional on all issues. For the sake of this conversation, we really are talking about traditional or progressive when it comes to sexuality and marriage, and not every issue involving sexuality. Right, so thank you. So the Global Methodist Church, right, their pastors will not perform same-sex weddings, their churches will not host them, and in the current language of our Book of Discipline, self-avowed practicing homosexuals will not be ordained to serve in their churches. And that will be uniform across the denomination. Right.
Two things. One, 70 churches that left, 60% of the congregation had to approve the
Right. Question was about the. Let me. That's a question about the disaffiliation process in terms of how many members had to vote. Let me get back to that because we're going to get to the details of the disaffiliation process.
other churches, Methodist, Presbyterian, etc., are any of them experiencing the same kind of divide or issue?
Right. Question is about other denominations going through the similar divides, divisions. Yes, they already have, and they've already split or splintered. The Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians have all gone through this. So if you are an Episcopal church, you can belong to the Episcopal Church in America, or you can belong to the Anglican Church in America, which is a more decidedly conservative body, as an example. And I'm not really conversant with the Presbyterian and Lutheran options, but everyone else has gone through this already. Yeah. Let me go ahead because I think probably we were already starting to get into some of the questions I'll engage with the rest of my conversation. So, presentation. So, I've used the language of traditional and progressive, and very often we think about these issues, same-sex marriage, ordination of self-avowed practicing homosexuals, in binary terms. Are you traditional or progressive? Do you believe that marriage should be and only can be a union between a man and a woman? Do you believe that that only those who are celibate in singleness and faithful in that kind of marriage can be properly ordained? And so there's a sense in which, of course, we are traditional or progressive about those particular questions, those particular issues. But there actually is a lot greater diversity of thought within that sort of that approach to this issue when it comes to how we live that out in community. And so one of the leaders of the Global Methodist Church several years ago introduced language to kind of clarify the diversity of perspectives that are present in the denomination and in most local churches. And Anthony, if you can put that graphic up for me, the next one after that. And so the language is not simply progressive and traditionalist, but progressive non-compatibilist, traditional non-compatibilist on either extreme, and then in the middle, both progressive compatibilist and traditional compatibilist. Now that's kind of confusing language. Everybody's kind of searching for a better word than compatibilist or non-compatibilist. But here's what that means. If I'm a traditional non-compatibilist, that does obviously mean that I believe marriage is and can only be a union between a man and a woman, not between two men or two women. But if I'm a traditional compatibilist, that means I can be in a church where other people think differently about those issues than I do. My difference of thought from them on that does not mean I can't be in a church with people who disagree about that issue. And in fact, it means I can be in a denomination where other pastors, other churches, maybe even other conferences believe and practice differently. So and so it's not, it's the sense that I have these beliefs, maybe our local church has these beliefs, our pastor is not going to perform same-sex marriages, we won't host those kind of unions, we won't receive an LGBTQIA pastor, but if the United Methodist Church across town, the majority there believes differently, practices differently, they welcome same-gendered couples, and they have a gay pastor, that's okay for them down there. I don't agree with it, but I don't have to be part of a different denomination from them. I can be in a church where we have diversity of belief and practice around these issues. That would be a traditional compatibilist position, but the non-compatibilist position would say, I can't be in a denomination where there's diversity of thought and practice around these issues. Have I muddied the waters, or does that make sense? All right? Same thing with progressive compatibilist and non-compatibilist, right? A progressive non-compatibilist would say, not only do I believe that God blesses same-gendered unions and God calls LGBTQIA persons into ministry, but I can't be in a church where those beliefs are denied. I need to be in a denomination where every annual conference will ordain LGBTQIA persons who are called into ministry. And every church welcomes and blesses same-gendered couples and performs same-gendered weddings. That's the non-compatibilist. I can't be in a church where a church across the town with it's also United Methodist. They have to be as inclusive as we are, or inclusive in the way that we are. That's the progressive non-compatibilist. The progressive compatibilist position says, well, this is what I believe, this is what our local church believes, what our pastor believes, this is what we practice about sexuality and marriage. But, you know, we may not agree with it, but we're okay being in a church where the church across town believes and practices differently. The example I used for years, which I can't really use anymore or not for much longer, is Mount Bethel and East Cobb UMC in Cobb County. Mount Bethel has been in the news. They are a decidedly conservative or evangelical church. East Cobb is not. There's a rainbow flag in front of their church, right? Both United Methodist. I would contend that they share a common commitment to Jesus as Savior and Lord. There's a lot that they share in terms of the heart of their faith, but clearly they have different beliefs and practices when it comes to sexuality, marriage, and ordination. And so what it would be to be in a denomination with those who are progressive and traditional compatibilists is that they would say, okay, we get it. Mount Bethel's going to do what it does, believe what they believe and practice what they practice. East Cobb is going to believe and practice what they believe and they practice. And we'll be part of one church together despite the tensions that come with that, despite the challenges that come with that. Again, Tom Lambrecht, a leader in the Wesleyan Covenant Association and now in the Global Methodist Church, introduced this language to help clarify the actual diversity of thought when it comes to these issues. It really is not as simple as, am I traditional perspective when it comes to marriage? Am I traditional perspective when it comes to ordination? I was at an annual conference, this is pre-COVID, several years ago now, and the first day is kind of a gathering time. People are checking in, they're walking around, they're catching up. I was walking through the conference seeing different colleagues of mine whom I know to be left of me and right of me. And then a lot of others who agree with me, which of course means they're right. That's not the point of the story. So I was walking around, right, and I'm seeing my colleagues. I'm just kind of aware that we're kind of all over the map on these issues, but also on other issues. Lots of other issues. We're not on the same page. We all believe in Jesus. Every pastor I've ever met in the North Georgia Annual Conference loves Jesus. Believes that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Believes that God is triune. Believes that salvation comes to us through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Believes that the risen Jesus has poured out and is pouring out the Holy Spirit into all who believe in Him, and that the Spirit is transforming us in the image of God's love. Every pastor I've ever met in the annual conference believes those core convictions of the Christian faith, of the Methodist understanding of the Christian faith. But when it comes to politics, when it comes to economics and racial justice and sexuality. We're kind of all over the map. So anyway, I'm walking around, I'm seeing all these colleagues. I'm not consciously thinking all of the thoughts I just unloaded on you, but I'm just kind of aware, like, we're a pretty big family, or to change images, a pretty big tent with a lot of diversity, right? And I had one feeling and one thought. My feeling was, like, I'm just so happy to be here. I'm so happy to see all of my friends. And my thought was, there's no part of me that is thinking, this would be better if she wasn't here. We'd be more faithful if he went somewhere else. There's diversity in my own family. There is. So part of it is biographical, right? So I will tell you right now, my agenda, my hope, my dream is to keep everyone who's already part of canon. There's no part of me that is thinking canon would be better if some people left. Because my assumption is canon embodies the same diversity of thought and practice that exists in our denomination. We're not of one mind when it comes to these issues. That doesn't mean some people take the Bible seriously and others don't. Some people believe in Jesus and others don't. No, it really just means that as we follow Jesus and read the Bible, we come to different conclusions about how the Scriptures speak to these issues. No one I have met here, and none of the clergy I know, have simply chucked the Bible out and say it's not relevant. And so my preference always is to keep people already in the boat together. Already on the journey together on the journey. That's my agenda. And I've assumed that if you're still here as part of this church, through everything you've been through in the last few years, you're here because you want canon to keep being the church that it's been. That doesn't mean we never change in some ways. Of course, we're going to grow and change. The world around us keeps changing, and we need to pivot how we do ministry to reach new neighbors in new ways with the old gospel. But I do assume you're here because the relationships you already have with one another are important to you. That's a value that you share. The people matter. The relationships matter. And diversity of thought on these issues may be irritating, inconvenient, frustrating, bewildering, but it's part of the reality of being a big tent church and a big tent denomination. There's a saying that is often attributed to John Wesley. He didn't actually say it, but the reason it keeps getting attributed to him is it so accurately reflects how he approached the Christian community and contentious issues. So here's the saying: in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, love. Of course, the older version says charity, which meant love. In essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, love. And that really is how Wesley went about his ministry. He was willing to partner with lots of people from across the theological spectrum in England doing ministry, making disciples of Jesus Christ. And he was very clear that the goal was not unity of thought, but unity in love. He was clear that we do need to agree on the unity, on the core convictions of the Christian faith, on the essentials of the gospel. But when it comes to other issues that are secondary, that are peripheral, that don't strike to the heart of the gospel, to the essentials of the faith, we can kind of think and let think. It means that we're going to agree to disagree on some issues. And so one of the ways of thinking about the splintering of the United Methodist Church and the decision that people face whether or not they'll remain or they will exit is kind of where they place these issues. Are these issues of sexuality and of ordination, are they essentials of the faith? Are they core convictions of the faith? Or do they belong to that sort of second tier? It doesn't mean they're not important. It's just that they don't strike to the heart of the faith. Now, if you think about, well, how do we define those things which are essential? Well, there are a couple ways we always kind of have. I mean, one is the Apostles' Creed, right? So I believe in the resurrection of the body. Like that's a core conviction of the Christian faith, that we will be raised bodily from the grave when Christ comes again. The resurrection of Jesus, the bodily resurrection of Christ, that's in there. Right? And so there, you can go through the Apostles' Creed and you say, these are things which the church identified pretty early on as being essential to the faith. These define the core of our faith. There can still be a lot of diversity of belief and practice around other issues. So the Apostles' Creed is one, the Nicene Creed is another. We don't use that in worship very often. It's got some pretty complicated phrases in it, but anyway, that's another one. And then also in the Book of Discipline, United Methodist Church has official sort of, it has articles of religion which we adopted, which Wesley lightly edited from the Anglican Church, from the Church of England. And that goes over things like the triune nature of God, the full humanity and divinity of Christ, the person and work of the Holy Spirit, the divinity of the Spirit, the nature of the church. It identifies what the sacraments are. And what the church is. It goes through, like I think there are 25 articles, 25 separate topics. These topics aren't there. They're not there. That's not to say they're not important. But they're not there. So let me just, Anthony, if you would put that, the compatibilist and non-compatibilist thing back up again. That would be great. So I want to kind of address the question, where do United Methodists fall on this spectrum? So it kind of depends on what part of the country you live in. If you live in California and you go to a United Methodist church in California, or you're part of the Nevada Pacific Conference, chances are pretty good that the vast majority of your pastors and churches are on the left side of that. They are either progressive compatibilist or progressive non-compatibilist. But not exclusively. There are traditionalist believers and churches on the West Coast in the United Methodist Church. It's just a question of percentages, right? If you go to the Southeast, where we live, you would not be surprised to find, I would assume, that the majority is probably to the right of that. I've read, no one's really sure, but I've heard others say, and it's kind of based on my interaction with clergy and with people in this church and other churches, I think the vast majority of United Methodists are in the center. They're either traditionalist compatibilists or progressive compatibilists. It's a big tent church. They have definite beliefs about sexuality and marriage and ordination, but they know that people sitting in the pew beside them or behind them or in front of them or the church down the street, there are differences in thought. There's not unity in thought and practice around these issues. And however inconvenient, uncomfortable, bewildering, frustrating at times, they are willing to live in that diversity around these issues. It's not simple, it's not easy, but they're willing to live with diversity on these issues. And so I've heard, again, the vast majority of us are kind of in the middle, and then you've got others on either what I will refer to as an extreme, just because they're on the outer edges. They don't represent the majority of the viewpoint of those who are United Methodist. But I don't know that for sure. That's one of the things that will get played out over the months and years to come. So I do want to put up the disaffiliation process. This is our conference's version of the process adopted by the General Conference in 2019. And so if a local church has a strong majority of members who are non-compatibilist, whether they are progressive or traditional, if they have a strong majority of members who are non-compatibilist, they're going to believe and act on the belief that they really can't remain United Methodist. Either because not every church is welcoming to same-sex couples and sexual minority pastors, or because some are. Either way, this process was created for churches to disaffiliate. And so, so for all United Methodist churches, not just those in the North Georgia Annual Conference, in order to disaffiliate, there has to be a called charge conference, which is a church-wide gathering of all professing members of the church. I want to be clear about that. You have to actually be an official member of the church, not just a frequent attender or even long-time attender. You have to actually have taken the vows of membership and be a professing member of the church. And the distinction we make now is between baptized and professing, right? We will baptize children, we'll baptize infants, and then at some point they have an opportunity, an invitation to confirm their faith, to kind of stand on their own feet and say, I'm here because I believe. That's when they become professing members. And so you have to have a charge conference gathering, and then in order to take the next step toward disaffiliation, you have to have a two-thirds majority of the professing members present for that charge conference gathering who vote in favor of disaffiliation. So that's a pretty high standard. That was the standard that was adopted by the General Conference. So two-thirds present. And so again, from my perspective, it's not simply a matter of do you have two-thirds of your members who are traditional when it comes to issues of sexuality and marriage. It's do you have two-thirds of your members who cannot, for reason of conscience, be in a church where there's diversity of thought around these issues. That they feel in their heart of hearts that they cannot be faithful to God and be in a church, in a denomination where there's diversity of thought and practice around these issues. And so, by and large, I think what you have seen so far is churches proceeding through this process who knew up front that's where we are. Like that's where our people are. They're not compatibilists, they're non-compatibilists by and large, or at least in sufficient number that this is the step that makes sense for us. So once that vote is taken, if you have two-thirds majority who vote to exit from the denomination, there's a date set for the disaffiliation to be made effective. It's at the end of June, or at least it was this year. I assume it would be next year as well. And then there is a financial component to this. In the past, if you wanted to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church, you had to give the denomination some of the equity that from your facilities. But that's not part of the disaffiliation process. But there are some financial components. So most of you are familiar with apportionments. Those are the financial support that we give to the ministries of the church beyond our local church. And so our asking for this year is roughly $80,000 or $85,000. I've forgotten the precise number. And so that support, that financial support, goes to the annual conference to support ministries in the North Georgia Annual Conference, but also through the annual conference to the Southeast jurisdiction and to the United Methodist Church. And that's how we support a lot of our general boards and agencies. That's how we support the denominational connection beyond our local church and even beyond the North Georgia Conference. So in order to be in good standing and be able to disaffiliate, you have to be current on the 12 months of apportionment payments preceding your disaffiliation, and then also give to the conference an additional 12 months of apportionments. So you're not just kind of dropping the bag. The other piece is you have to be current on your benefits payments, and then there is a number set for your share of the unfunded pension liability for retired United Methodist pastors. This is a lot like a divorce, right? You don't just get to say, I'm leaving and I'm taking what I want. There's a splitting of assets. You hope that there is some measure of fairness or justice. So just because we're part of the connection, we've made certain financial commitments, and we need to do something to honor those commitments before we leave. So that's the financial piece. And then if all of that's in order, at the following meeting of the annual conference, and this is what we did in June, your name, if you've met all those other conditions, and your name appears on a list, and the clergy and lay delegates to annual conference vote to ratify your disaffiliation. And assuming that you have, once again, met all the financial requirements by the deadline, by the disaffiliation date, then it becomes effective. And you cease to be a United Methodist Church. There are a couple other things that go along with that, but that's the big picture. And the process adopted by the General Conference did put a deadline for this particular process. It's not open-ended. It's through the end of next year. And our bishop has made clear that they're not going to set a hard date for everyone to get everything done in time for the annual conference gathering next June. They recognize that this can be a difficult process. If there's a financial component that's difficult for local churches to meet who really do want to exit and have voted to exit, there will be time for them to make those arrangements and raise those funds, and then there will still be time for them. There probably will end up being a special called conference of the annual conference sometime in the fall of 2023 to ratify other disaffiliation agreements. Let me stop at that point and see if there are any questions. Okay, the question has to do is, was there a process for disaffiliation prior to this one being created, and will there be something after it is terminated? Yes, and I don't know. So there was a process for disaffiliation. Some people viewed it as punitive, right? I don't think we have to characterize it in that way. It was more expensive. So most of you probably know. If you don't, I'm sorry, I'm the one to break it to you. But no local church actually owns its property. It's held in trust for the conference. The conference actually owns it. And I know what you're going to say. We raised the money. Why, I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole, but that's the reality. It's held in trust. But you can blame John Wesley. That is right. It was sort of tied up in Wesley's conviction that I will send you the preacher you need, not necessarily the one that you want. And you're part of a connection. And it shouldn't be easy for you to leave. And we've invested in you, and you've invested in us, and that's a mutual commitment, and that is the reality. So it is also the case that the conference has invested in this community and in this facility. So the old process, right, the church had, the denomination, the conference actually had to get some equity out of your facilities. And so it was a more complicated formula. I just know it was more expensive. And so that's part of what the General Conference did. They wanted to streamline the process and make it less expensive and make it easier for churches they didn't want to keep people here who really wanted and need to leave. But at the same time, not wanting people to exit and just leave the churches behind holding somebody else's check, if that makes sense. That's why the apportionments, the benefits payments they remain part of the agreement. But what happens after that? Sorry, I pointed there because I thought it might still be up. What happens after that? I don't know. There's a general conference scheduled for 2024. So at the very least, I'm guessing we'll have an 8-month or so interregnum where the old process will be all that's in place. But then the general conference will probably take up the issue again of where do we go from here. Yeah, I saw some other hands. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
There were 3 issues. One was ordination, homosexuals, one was same-sex unions, and the other was the statement in the Book of Discipline that homosexuality is incompatible with Christianity. Now, the vote actually strengthened the first 2 and ignored the third, as I recall. Mm-hmm. Mostly because of the non-U.S. participants. So that remains on the books, right? Mm-hmm. And will the United Methodist Church look at those 3 things again in the next general conference?
So the question has to do with the statements in the Book of Discipline that really kind of are at the heart of the disagreement we have had since 1972. That's when a few lines were added to the Book of Discipline, and we've been having this argument ever since. So those statements are, in one place it says that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. In another, it says that we will not ordain self-avowed practicing homosexuals. And then in another, it says, and I'm not quoting, this is not verbatim, but basically our pastors will not perform and our churches will not host same-sex weddings. That's the effect of that line. So the question is, will all of that be on the table at the next General Conference? I'm assuming it will, but I have no idea what will happen. I've heard speculation that those phrases will simply be eliminated, that they'll be deleted as a way of just acknowledging that we're not all on the same page about that. Our intent is to be a big tent church, to give permission to pastors and local churches and annual conferences to believe differently and practice differently on these issues. So that is one option I've heard, is that they think that there will be a move immediately to just remove those lines. I've heard others who say, well, I don't think we're going to act that quickly. I think it's going to take a while for it to kind of sort out. And that does in part have to do with like how many churches exit, how many pastors exit, kind of who are we on the other side of the splintering, but the reality is the splintering is going to go on for a few years. And so I don't... Right. It will be. Yeah, and well, let me say this. I asked the question before, where do United Methodists fall on that spectrum, from traditional non-compatibilist to progressive non-compatibilist? There's a global distinction as well, so that the U.S. and Europe tends as a body, if you just looked at us in this country and in Europe, we're kind of more in the middle. But if you look at Africa and Asia, they are overwhelmingly conservative and traditional. The question is, and what I don't think people have a good answer for, is whether they are compatibilist or non-compatibilist. The assumption has been that they must be non-compatibilist, but I'm hearing more and more from leaders in Africa, no, we are very traditional on these issues, and we will continue to live what we believe, but that doesn't mean we're non-compatibilist. Our relationships with the United Methodist Church are important to us. We're open to a global church and when there's a diversity of thought and practice on these issues. And so all of that just muddies the waters. I really don't know what will happen at the next General Conference. Go ahead. No, if you have left the United Methodist Church and united with the Global Methodist Church, you'll have you are free from General Conference forever.
Are people in Africa joining the Global Methodist?
Oh, good question. Yeah, I don't know. The question is, are people in Africa, churches in Africa, joining the Global Methodist Church? And I don't know if they've taken that step. That's a great question. I haven't even seen any coverage of that. That's not to say it's not out there. Right. I mean, this is clearly an American-centric unfolding. This is here, and then we'll see how it ripples outward. So yeah, I really don't know. Yeah. Right. That's the intention, is to be a global church. And I think the assumption has been, the belief has been on the part of those who form the Global Methodist Church, that many of the churches, pastors, and even conferences in Africa would exit the United Methodist Church and join the Global Methodist Church. We'll see if that happens or not. Any other questions before I go on? I'll work. Right. Yes, so good question. It had to do with appointments this last time around. And it's my understanding, talking with our DS, Rodrigo Cruz, that the cabinet and the bishop for the last 2 years have been trying to get pastors and churches matched up so nobody gets stuck, like our pastor wants to leave but we want to stay, or we want to leave but our pastor wants to stay, right? They're trying to get them aligned. So that yeah. But having said that, I do know, like, of one pastor in our district, a woman who was appointed to a local church, and then before she made the move, they took a vote to disaffiliate, and she had no intention of leaving the United Methodist Church, and so then they had to kind of scramble to figure out, what are we going to do, because we can't send her there when they're about to leave. They will like literally be walking out the door of the United Methodist Church as she is walking in. So they've tried really hard to get people lined up, so that doesn't happen. Obviously, it's not 100%, but they've tried. Mike, I saw your hand up too.
Yes, you mentioned the issue of being a compatibilist or not, and that seems to me maybe more of a nuanced thing than it first seems. I mean, for example, the book of Discipline has had the wording about homosexuality being incompatible with Christian teaching since long before I started attending this church.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, during that entire time, maybe 35 years, I don't believe I've ever heard a sermon from the pulpit saying anything particularly bad about homosexuality or the LGBT community. So I mean, on the strength of what's in the book of Discipline, I can think of myself as being compatibilist, but I don't know if I would be compatibilist if my situation had been different and we had been having, monthly sermons, damning the LGBT community to hell. I would feel differently about it. So there's a kind of a nuance as to what are these people that you're getting along with doing? Are they happy to stay in their own lane, or are they trying to convert you always to their way of thinking?
Right. So Mike's talking about his experience here, and I'm sure for many of you as well, would have been different, and perhaps at some point was different when these issues were addressed publicly from the pulpit in a way that was more non-compatibilist in tone and orientation. And I think so. If you have a pastor who's non-compatibilist in approach, whether from the left or the right, progressive or traditional, that will tend to create a certain kind of environment and make it difficult for those who are more compatibilist in orientation to feel like they have a place in the church. If this is presented as an essential and something on which we must agree, then yeah, that's going to create a certain kind of environment that's going to affect how we feel about that. So, yeah.
Those of us of a certain age can remember here in this city where it was illegal for a black man to marry a white woman.
Right.
And there were struggles inside this Methodist church, Methodist Georgia Conference, a long race. And over the last 40 years, 50 years, we've come a very long way. This feels to me like something that a discussion that might have happened, in the late 50s and early 60s, where people had very strong beliefs about the people that came through.
Yeah. So Bob is pointing out similar or related issues that we've struggled with previously. So his example was interracial marriage. That was illegal everywhere at one point in this country, and then in a diminishing number of places. And the church had arguments over that. We also have right. We've had arguments over that. We have had arguments over divorce and remarriage. We've had arguments over that. In the 30s, if I performed a marriage for someone who had gotten divorced for any reason other than adultery and then been remarried, I could be defrocked. Because Jesus seems to say that the only legitimate grounds for divorce is adultery, and if you get divorced for any other reason and then get remarried, that second union is inherently adulterous. And so there are conservative churches, tend to be more Baptist churches, where they will not perform weddings for people who are getting remarried. And so the other issue that we've dealt with earlier, this would be more like the 1800s, is whether or not you would perform a wedding for someone who is Christian and someone who is not. A mixed marriage in terms of religious sense. So these are related issues. We've kind of lived with them. We've had many of the same heated arguments. We've engaged in many of the same accusations and name calling. And so, in a sense, we've been down this road before. And right, and some of and right, yep. Well, let me move forward just real quickly with a couple questions, kind of looking ahead. Okay, what's going to happen? Not quite that yet, Anthony. I'll come back to that. But it's always good to see John Wesley. You know, he looks so young and hip. So how many churches will leave the UMC? I've heard debate about this. Some have suggested that as many as 30% of the churches will leave the United Methodist Church. I think in some areas of the country that will be true. But in other areas of the country, obviously, that's not going to be true. So maybe it all kind of works out. It could be in some parts of the country that a majority of the churches will leave the United Methodist Church. And so I think North Georgia is kind of, my take is that North Georgia, by and large, is kind of more in the middle. We're a pretty big tent conference. In my experience, at least most of the pastors are definitely in the compatibilist kind of range, right? Whether progressive or traditional, they're compatibilists. They want to stay UMC. Clearly, others not. I have a couple friends, colleagues from my previous appointment who left the United Methodist Church this past June. Both of their churches have become independent churches. So it's not all of us, but I suspect that a healthy majority will stay. South Georgia, now I don't know. You could have enough churches exit from the South Georgia Conference and from the North Georgia Conference that what you end up with is a Georgia annual conference. Or you have one bishop presiding over the Georgia Episcopal area composed of both a North and a South Georgia Conference. Sometimes bishops serve more than one conference. That is possible. So I don't really know. I've heard 10%, it will only be about 10%, just kind of banking on 70% of the United Methodists and the churches being basically in that compatibilist range and wanting to find a way to stay together, however uncomfortable. And then I want to ask, well, what will kind of long range happen to the United Methodist Church? And this is my personal conviction. I think that we will see at least three things. One is that I think we will continue to be, though sort of own being, a diverse church. That around these and probably other issues, we will think and live differently. These are not the only issues on which we disagree. But certainly all the conversation I hear is that the intention is not for the United Methodist Church to become an exclusively progressive church or an exclusively liberal church. You may pick up on some of the rhetoric coming from some segments of the traditionalist camp that, the United Methodist Church is destined inevitably to become, don't believe them, they're going to turn it into a progressive church. All the conversation I hear is that we want to be a big tent church. We want to be a church with conservatives, liberals, and centrists, where we create a structure for people to believe and practice differently around these issues. And I really do believe that is what we will see. Some areas of the country, it will be majority progressive. And in other areas of the country, it will be majority evangelical or traditionalist. We will be smaller. And this gets to one of the issues that we're not really paying that much attention to while we argue over this. The United Methodist Church has been in decline for decades with no end in sight. In 1972, we had about 3.6 million members. By 2010, we were down to about 3 million. And the projection is that by 2050, we will have less than 1 million members. It'll be a third of the size that we are right now. U.S. Thank you. Yeah, that's an important distinction, U.S. The United Methodist Church outside this country, especially in Asia and Africa, is exploding, is growing. Their growth curve is, onward and upward. So we will be smaller, even though I believe, third thing, I think that we will see a revived United Methodist Church, which is to say a United Methodist Church that reclaims the heart of our faith and refocuses on its mission to make disciples of Jesus Christ. Once we kind of get clear of the splintering and we kind of get into a place where we have parted peacefully or not, we will basically have the headspace and the energy to refocus on mission. And this looks ahead to next week. I honestly do believe that Methodism, that the Wesleyan way of following Jesus, is ideally suited for life in a post-Christian country. Now, I don't mean that we don't need Jesus. I just mean that Christianity has become less dominant. You can no longer assume that your neighbors are Christian. Right? We are a more religiously diverse country, and that's not going to change however much we may want that to change by force of law. That is not going to change. But that doesn't mean the church is done. That doesn't mean that the gospel is defeated. And I believe for multiple reasons that the Wesleyan understanding of the gospel and living together in grace is ideally suited for life in these times. One of the things I love about Methodism, about the Wesleys, is they never claimed, and we've never claimed, to be the church. We've only ever claimed to be a church. We've never claimed to be the way to follow Jesus, just a way to follow Jesus. That's part of what I think people will find compelling about it. And that doesn't mean we don't have strong convictions. It's just we don't think we alone define what it means to be a follower of Christ or to be a church. And it tends to be, and I'm giving you a quick preview of coming attractions, it's a both-and faith for an either-or world. We want to embrace both the head and the heart. Vital piety in terms of our relationship with God, but then also loving service in terms of our neighbors. We don't do one or the other, we do both and. We do word and table. We'll do informal contemporary worship and traditional robes, hymnals, organ worship. It's not because we lack conviction or we're wishy-washy. It's because we believe that the church, the Christian faith, is a broad river fed by many streams, and let's drink from as many streams as we possibly can. It's all great. It's all good. So I'll come back to that next week. I do think we will be a diverse church. We will be what we have been. We'll just create a structure to give permission for there to be diversity of thought and practice around issues of sexuality. We will be smaller. Even though there are pockets of growth in the United Methodist Church in this country, there are certainly local churches that are growing. There are some conferences that are growing. As a whole, we will, barring a dramatic miracle of God, we will continue in decline. And I think one of the reasons God's not going to just sort of dramatically, boom, grant us growth is that we have to go through a season of repenting and rethinking and refocusing and replanning. It's part of the journey that He has in store for us. And so that's not a sign of failure. That's actually part of the unfolding work of God. He'll make us smaller to make us better. And then we'll see revival. And then finally, what will happen with canon, and we're all out of time, so I can't answer that question. And it's not funny, but I still was hoping. So that is the question, and I honestly can't answer that question this morning. I will tell you that it's been my understanding and my sense that although we are not of the same mind on these issues of marriage and ordination, again, I've already said this, I've assumed that you're here because you want to be here and be part of the church with the people who are already here. And that those who would have pushed hard for the canon to leave the United Methodist Church and join the Global Methodist Church or become independent, quite frankly, for a variety of reasons, aren't here anymore. I mean, I'm just... this is kind of what I've heard about recent history. You all have claimed canon, and canon is a theologically diverse church, a politically diverse church. Not all on the same page when it comes to these issues. And so that was my assumption, is that that's kind of where we are. We're in the middle. We're not on either end of that spectrum. I could be wrong. I could be wrong about that. Rather than rushing to take a vote, hey, let's find out. Wouldn't that be fun? It might be more helpful at some point to have a poll. You can do this. There are apps that help you do this, where you present that kind of spectrum and you give opportunity. You have a kind of called all-church meeting, It would be like a non-charge conference, charge conference, right? It wouldn't be official. We wouldn't be doing any business. We're not taking any official votes. We just kind of want to get a sense of where we are on the spectrum, because I do think that would tell you a lot. It's not enough to know in my traditional perspective. That's the first question. The second one is, and where do we go with that? So I think that's the question before us. Again, I'm open to discovering, to my surprise, that there are strong passions on the right or the left that we can't be in a church or a denomination with diversity of thought around these issues. We have to be all one or the other, and we need to leave to go left or go right, or go it alone. I'm open to discovering that that's where you are. I'll be surprised if that's where you are, based on what I've been told and what I've witnessed myself, but I know I could be wrong. I could be mistaken. I will tell you that I will remain United Methodist. That's where I am. I want to be in a Big Tent church. So I want to wrap it up with a quote from John Wesley. This is from his, it's a sermon, but it was never actually preached. I think it was like an open letter, Catholic Spirit. He remarks its famous question, though we cannot think alike, may we not love alike? Now, context, he was addressing Roman Catholics, and obviously he was not part of the same denomination as Roman Catholic neighbors. But that sense pervaded everything he did. It's why he would work with people who weren't part of the Anglican Church. It's why he would work with people who were in the Anglican Church who had some different beliefs about some issues. Love is primary. Love is first and foremost. And if we can't think alike, there's some non-essentials where we're going to have a diversity of thought and practice. Can we still love alike? And then the last one is from Hebrews. This is one of my favorite verses. Let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds. And I love the word provoke. It jumps out at you because it's not an obvious word choice. Wouldn't it make more sense if the author, we don't know who wrote Hebrews, if they said, well, let us encourage one another, to love and good deeds. No, it's provoke. That's an irritating word. And this gets to the heart, one of the reasons why I really want to be in a theologically diverse church, because my siblings to my left and my right provoke me to love and good deeds. They make me think about things that I might not think about on my own. They make me see things and deal with things that I might be happy to ignore or minimize or deny. They provoke me to love and good deeds. If you think about it, most American Christians of a certain age, right, we know Billy Graham and Martin Luther King Jr. And we know that they represent different kind of segments of the church in this country. And they both had different, though overlapping, messages. Right? The focus of Billy Graham's ministry was to help individuals experience the forgiving, reconciling grace of God, to come home to God's love. And then, right, to live that out in their everyday lives, but his focus was on the man, the woman who did not yet know Jesus, had not yet surrendered their lives to him, and encourage them to come to that place where they confess their sins, they receive God's forgiving grace, and then he did want to get them connected to a local church. Right? But that relationship with God, forgiving grace of God, was his primary focus. That was not the primary focus of Martin Luther King Jr. He was looking at peace, the shalom of God in this country, in human community. His goal was to help us move toward the world as it will be. That's the language I use most often, right? We live in the world as it is, toward the world as it will be. And in the book of Revelation, the risen Christ, the reigning Christ, is praised for having been slaughtered to redeem or ransom for God's saints from every tribe and language and people and nation. What Revelation shows us is the world as it will be, which is God's varied people, diverse people from every tribe and language and people and nation gathered together before the throne. Let's live toward that. And segregation was not that. So King's focus was to help us live together as brothers and sisters in Christ, more fully and faithfully than we had. Now, we have sometimes tended to say Billy Graham preached the gospel and Martin Luther King Jr. did something else. That's just politics. That's not true. And you know it's not true, right? They both provoke us to love and good deeds. My, more progressive colleagues and siblings in my family look a little nervously at Billy Graham. And my more evangelical colleagues look a little nervously at Martin Luther King Jr. Right? But we actually need both of those prophets of God. And we need both of the traditions that they represent. The reason I want to be in a theologically diverse church is because I honestly do believe that we need each other. We are better together than we will be apart because of what we have blinders, we have blind spots, and we need our siblings to kind of remind us, hey, we have to pay attention to this too. This is part of the gospel. This is part of what it means to be church. This is part of what it means to live out our faith in Jesus. And so I love the word provoke, because that is exactly what it is. It's not comfortable. So that's it. I've run over time, but you still have to stay for the whole service. You don't get bonus time. And we'll have more time for conversation. We'll have the reception for Heather after the service too, so we can follow up some conversation then, and we'll be back here next week. Let me offer a word of prayer, and then we'll move on. Gracious and loving God, thank you for the grace, mercy, and love that has embraced each of us and all of us together and is leading us together from the world as it is toward the world as it will be. Sometimes we agree on what that means, and sometimes we disagree. God, may we be united by a shared commitment to Jesus, and may we do all things in love, even when we're provoking each other, even when it feels like we're sticking our finger in each other's eyes. May we find, much to our surprise, that provocation is redemptive and helpful, and that you are in it. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks for coming, everybody. I appreciate your time. No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she now has a church downtown.